Next, I'd like to suggest how to write a literature review. Again, these slides come from multiple sources. In this case, it comes from the School of Public Policy, uh, Johnson Shoyama. Uh, so the suggestion that we've been making since then was to focus on thematically organizing your literature following the themes in the statement of the problem. It's very important to pay attention on literature that directly speak about your statement of the problem and literature that are just related to your statement of the problem. These will also help you identify which statements are worth considering and which are not. So the best way to organize the literature is by theme or by topic. Of course, this would entail knowledge of outlining, which will play a very important role also in the construction of the literature review. Yes, outlining is a very difficult process, it's a very tedious process. But once you have outlined it properly, it is a very helpful tool to understanding what will happen next. Ron Cooley suggests thinking of organization of a literature review like a Russian nesting dolls. I'm sure you're familiar with Russian nesting dolls. If not, they're Googleable. So you start, therefore, with large themes, with the general statement of the problems and ideas, and then you try to trickle down into the dimensions of the concepts on which this statement of the problems are hinged on. This would be the nested sub-ideas and components. Eventually, you'd see that identifying the concept, the dimensions of a particular concept will also play a very important role in the construction of the instrument for data gathering, as it will also define, and yes, it comes from the literature, not from your mind or not from thin air, the indicators for your questionnaire or even the questions for your interview guide. So the sub-themes, of course, may emerge only as you are going to write your first draft. But before you begin to write your literature review, just as we have said, you have to consider the heading scheme you plan to use. And as we have also suggested, follow the statement of the problem. If you have 3 statements of the problem, which were written in a way that they are coherent with each other, when one becomes necessary in order to solve the greater problem, then you'd see that outlining them will play also a very important role in the organization of the literature review. This system, of course, of numbering, like you would see next, also constitutes a way of clarifying the important themes and the sub-themes. So you can write with an introduction to the literature review, and then the main headings can constitute your statements of the problem. The second level headings are, of course, can possibly be your dimensions in the study, when the third level headings can be a sub-dimension if there are, and the fourth level headings can be the indicators, the examples, the concrete manifestations of the sub-dimension. But of course, that will vary depending also on the level or degree you want to approach your statement of the problem. It's also just worth emphasizing that sometimes in a problem where problem 1, 2, and 3 are really related to each other, such that the results of problem 1 will eventually lead to the results in problem number 2. And then the results in problem number 2 will result in problem number 3. For example, in problems that wanted to understand the status of the particular capability in order to identify the weakness of that capability and then suggest interventions to that capability, you'd see that the dimensions of the capability, whatever that capability is only mentioned in problem number 1, but is carried over in problem number 2 and problem number 3, even if it's not explicitly articulated in the statements of the problem. So that, for example, what is the status of this capability and it has an ABC, your weaknesses might not have, what is the weaknesses of this capability can be your problem statement number 2, but in the RRL, it's fleshed out. Even that section on weaknesses is fleshed out also in terms of ABC. And in a similar way, the interventions that is suggested to address the weaknesses in the capability in problem number 3 are also fleshed out as ABC following the articulation of the dimensions in problem number 1. And as the rule of outlining says, for example, I have a weakness for capability A, I cannot simply have just one. No? In this example, you can see third level heading 2.2.1 and fourth level heading 2.2.1.1. But in reality, you cannot, in proper, correct layouting capability or mindset, you cannot put a 2.2.1 without a 2.2.2. There has to be at least 2 third level headings. In the same way that you can only put a 2.2.1.1, a fourth level heading, if there is at least 2 fourth level headings, which is 2.2.1.2. So please take note then that if you would say you wanted to identify the challenges in dimension A, you need to be able to identify at least 2 challenges in dimension A. There can be more. That's not an issue here. The issue here is when there's just one challenge in this dimension and there's no other. No, that's technically improper. And then you'd see now that the match to the identified weaknesses would be the intervention. That's where the one-to-one correlation, relation, or the alignment would be found. Another thing we're emphasizing is the synthesizing. The RRL is a synthesis. That's why synthesizing is key to a literature review. A synthesis, therefore, puts together at least 2 literatures, books, journals, policies, whatever, and identifies, interpret the themes, trends, and the relationships between and among these 2. Therefore, the literature review, whether you like it or not, will reveal the similarities, the differences, and even show how the literature advances the research area. Here also, you'd see that a thematic organization can in fact make the synthesizing easier. And also important. So synthesizing, the literature review is therefore a synthesis. So when you're writing, for example, a literature review, and you are basically only reporting one literature, that's not synthesizing at all. That is, if anything, merely utilizing a singular document. Synthesizing entails putting together at least 2 texts. Now, the way we are used is the silo approach. Students who are new to writing literature reviews, or even to write academic writing for that matter, use what we call the silo approach instead of synthesis. We organize our literature review by study, by literature types, instead of by theme or by trend. Remember that when you report a text in the literature review, we are not analyzing every study individually, or we are not analyzing each study separately. Instead, the goal of the literature review is to actually show how the studies are related to one another, and also how these studies are useful. And I will emphasize that word useful in your own study, so that we do not actually put many literatures only for padding purposes, discussing about these texts as if they are separate from the study. Instead, we are discussing these texts only in a way that they are related to the study. And that too is important to provide you with a more visual understanding of the silo approach versus the synthesis approach. And for that matter, we thank the School of Public Policy Escape.ca for this one. But if you like this content, I hope you'd consider subscribing to Samo't sa Simula. This is my YouTube channel. You'd see that the silo approach is actually divided into, is actually reflected in this image as the two water tanks. Whether you like it or not, the silo approach simply reports in an annotated version or in a summary version the results and the findings of the study. But it doesn't say at all how this study are related to your study, to your paper, to your work. In that sense, therefore, we are simply reporting, not synthesizing. The synthesis is actually what you see on the right side of the screen. That's when you weave together the different studies in order for it to create a tapestry, a lens that you're going to use to understand your study. In that way, then, it's very important for us to be able to always ask ourselves why we are using these texts, or why we are reporting these texts, and how this is, in fact, affecting understanding the way we understand things. So, this is an example of the silo approach. That's when you simply say that this study said this study said that, this study said this, without actually telling us what is being said. Of course, I have to say that I did, in another video, I did discourage you. I did discourage you to actually simply enumerate the text, just like in the example of synthesis here. That's also not the case. The more important point, perhaps, is to simply recognize how these papers are related to each other and how they are different to each other, but also in relation to your study. I think that's the more important thing to consider. So let's look at silo and synthesis along these lines. So in the silo approach, you only mention the study separately. Comparisons are not made, relationships are not drawn. So you can ignore the previous examples of these slides, but you can learn from this distinction. In the synthesis, no studies discussed in isolation there. That's very important. Study findings and methods are compared, and also the relationships are drawn. It's very important that you see the distinction. In the silo approach, I just mentioned that there's a book that talk about this one and then provides you with an annotated bibliography or reports that this paper said this. But no comparisons, no relationships, no linking as to how this paper is significant to the research being conducted. On the other hand, in the synthesis approach, what is very important is how that no studies discussed in isolation, and therefore we study the findings, we compare the findings with other texts, we compare the methodologies. We also demonstrate how these studies going to play an important role in your study. Second, no relationships drawn between the student's own research and the research discussed in the literature review there. While in the synthesis approach, the student's own research is at the center of the discussion, and therefore is the one that defines the analysis or even the comparison with all of the studies. We write the literature review in support of our study, not the other way around, that we become the periphery of the reporting. Third, literature review is organized chronologically or even randomly, no? Or even in terms of literature types, books, journals, and the like. In the synthesis, the literature review is organized by the themes, by the concepts, and even by the dimensions, which are identified by the statement of the problem, just as we have said in an earlier recording, but also as it is relevant to the study. In the silo approach, the individual studies are referred to only once, but in the synthesis approach, and this is okay, perfectly okay, individual studies are referred to multiple times under different sub-themes. That too plays a very important role. Now, these are also very important words that are used to signal synthetic evidence. Again, you'd see that we did speak about signaling in a previous recording, but now we will clarify further what we mean by this one. And you'd see that here we will try to re-emphasize words that are used to signal similarity or comparison, no? Similar to, similar, similarly, likewise, both, and also, not only, but also in related or similar research, or to, or comparable to, compare to or with, correspond with, related, relate to. Those are all similarity or comparison words, and you can contrast that with the dissimilarity, difference, or contrast words. Contrary to, on the contrary, on the other hand, in contrast to, unlike, conversely, but, whereas, while, however, and although. Again, we thank the School of Public Policy, sk.ca, for these slides, and thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please do not hesitate to subscribe, like, and even share the YouTube channel Samo't sa Simula. Thank you very much.